Okay, so that's a track of the Dark Star album called North, which came out last year. The significance of that record that is partly to do with its context. It came out on a hyperdub label, which is largely but not exclusively associated with dubstep, and it really comes out of this trajectory starting that I was talking about yesterday, starting off with rave, going through jungle, drum and bass, garage, and I think this track then, and the whole sound of it, and the whole album, North, is quite symptomatic for a number of reasons. One of which is just the level of sort of introversion and melancholy that is palpable in that track and the whole sound of it. By comparison with the collective euphoria that was at the start of that trajectory. So from being music that was about certain experience of collectivity, it becomes a music about isolation, a particular quality of melancholy, which I started to point to yesterday, some of the causes of that melancholy, and kind of digital melancholy. And that's what I really want to explore today, partly, is the form of that digital melancholy, particularly in relation to this, what I see as this crisis of space-time brought about by communicative capitalism, you could say. So the first thing to know about that music then is the sadness, the introversion, the fact that it's really about an individual in a way that the music that inspired it was really not. The second thing to note about it is the strange atemporality of the sound. Now, though that came out in 2010, there's nothing very much marking it out as coming from 2010. There's certain glitches or effects on the vocal, digital effects, that you wouldn't expect to have found on a record coming out in 1990, but that if you'd have heard something like that, wouldn't have caused you a great shock. I think part of the temporal dimension of the crisis I'm talking about is this issue of, atemporality, the question of just perform this test in your mind. If you could imagine something being played on the radio in a particular year from the past that has come out now, would it have caused a shock or not? And I think increasingly we can imagine going further and further back in time with music that is now presented to us as contemporary and imagining it not causing a shock. So I think if that, can we imagine that record played in as far back as 1980 even, and people being shocked, or even surprised or perturbed? I don't think so even. I think we can imagine that record coming on the radio in 1980 and people thinking it was, some group inspired by New Order or something like that. That's quite odd, and I think we take this for granted now. Think how long ago 1980 is. 1980 years. I have to remind myself, 30 years ago, over 30 years ago, whatever. And just think about the difference between 1950 and 1980. If you took, let's say, a New Order record from 1980 and took it back to 1950 and put that on the radio, there would be a lot of, disjuncture there. People would be surprised at what they were hearing. The whole span. Think of the whole span. 1950 pre-rock and roll to 1980 post-punk, disco, post-disco by that point. You know, not everything that was in between that. You know, vast changes in music and culture. The 30 years subsequent, we're in a situation where, you know, a group who, you know, are coming out of the, and can issue a record on, you know, one of the leading sort of popular experimental labels in the UK, and we can conceive of that record having come out 30 years ago. I'm not saying it actually could have done, but the point is that it's possible to perform that thought experiment, isn't it? Where someone did hear it and thought, okay. Now, this is not criticism of Darkstar or criticism of anything, really. It's just to point to the strange and involuted and sort of enfolded temporality in which we now live. The increasingly flattened out nature of sort of cultural time. Second slide, oh, yes. Right, okay, we've moved forward, right. Okay, okay, so anyone recognise this? What do you know what film this is from?
Is it Dawn of the Dead?
Oh, God, interesting. No, it's that's no, that's really good though. It's from The Terminal. Have you seen this film? With it's on British TV like every week. It seems to be on every week, and you know, I sort of see it halfway through, and I don't think I've ever seen the whole thing. But I keep watching it. I don't know why. And then I didn't know why. And then I realised the message it was trying to send me. Okay, this film is really quite a little known Spielberg film with Tom Hanks in possibly his most annoying film ever, an annoying role ever. And that's saying something, given it's Tom Hanks, right? But where he plays this. He plays someone who comes from, I think it's a fictional East European country. But while he's flying over to the US, there's some civil war in his country, and that country ceases to exist, so he becomes a stateless citizen. So that when he arrives in the JFK, he's not allowed to leave the airport. And so he has to stay in the airport for weeks, and I don't know if it's months, a long time anyway. And it's apparently it's based on a real case, actually. And okay, so what message is this trying to send me? Okay, well, what is the fantasy here? Well, remember that you know, Baudrillard said the point of Disneyland was to establish that it was a real America that was beyond, you know, that was beyond Disneyland, that could be differentiated from Disneyland. Well, isn't the point of The Terminal to establish that there is a real America beyond the airport that will be different from being in the airport itself? You know, that that when you leave, that when he you know, when the Tom Hanks character gets to leave the airport, there'll be something vastly different from this array of shops and chain stores and all of that that he can go into. You know, but that is not true. But actually, what is interesting, having just been to JFK recently for the first time, is the way that this airport bears no relation to JFK, and that's not a very good image of it actually. But if you see the film is full of sort of franchise, retail, multinationals, all of that. JFK is actually pretty modest. The amount of shops that are there. Yeah. It's really, particularly if you've come from like Heathrow, where Terminal 5, which you know, where you're like immersed in you know, global shopping mall, and to go to the US, and it is somewhat Sovietized. It feels like that. They just learn about, oh, we can have shops at airports, but so they constructed this simulated, hyper commodified, hyper commercialized JFK for this film, and here's perhaps one other dimension of capitalist realism. You know, capitalist realism, when I coined the term, I didn't actually coin it. I mean, the way I used it is kind of specific, I suppose, to a series of interests of mine, but actually other people had used it before, notably a group of German pop artists in the 60s who really who used it as an echo, which I also intended, of socialist realism. socialist realism, as what brought in under Stalin to replace the early efflorescence of modernism after the 1917 revolution, to bring back sort of familiar images, familiar and familial propagandistic images, the family together, all muscle bound and all of that, and with ploughs and machinery. So part of my notion of capitalist realism was, we clearly live in the midst of that, but it's PR and advertising, which are, our equivalent of that. And of course, if one is to realistically represent what it's like to live in capitalism, then you have to have lots of brands everywhere, lots of product placement. And the level of product placement in the terminal is massive. Every scene has got him in some retail outlet or holding some, debris from some franchise multinational in his hands.
Take a job in the airport to be able to buy a Hugo Boss.
Yeah, yes, that's right. Yes. Okay, now, so why am I talking about this now? Well, what I'm increasingly interested in is the parallels really between what I was first talking about, which is this sense of, to use the term that Bruce Sterling, the former cyberpunk author, has started to circulate, atemporality. What is the relationship between that sense of atemporality and space? Airports were a classic example of what the French theorist Marc Auger has called a non-place. In his book Non-Places, he makes an opposition between this kind